Over the last century, we've had significant historical events which affect our current society, and that's why we talk about it so we don't repeat the same mistake. But when we look at issues in school like discrimination and assimilation, how is this actually helping? Maybe we're raising awareness, trying to reconcile. What has this actually done to the victims here? Today, I'll be talking about how our education has affected Indigenous people. Maybe the physical classroom hasn't changed, but in terms of the curriculum, it couldn't be more different. That leads me to my question. To what extent have Indigenous ideas, history, and Tuat Seeing been included in our current day curriculum? Has this actually had any tangible effects on the Indigenous community, and how? So, let's go over a very brief Indigenous history in Canada. Indigenous people have been in Canada for around 12,000 years. Then, Christopher Columbus found America and European settlers arrived. Considering the Indigenous people were here long before the settlers, it makes sense they were often involved in Euro Canadian history. They traded fur with the settlers, fought wars against and alongside the settlers, and more. But relatively recently, in 1931, the government decided that they wanted to try and assimilate the indigenous into Euro Canadian culture and try to make the indigenous be more like them. And so, residential schools were born. They taught the indigenous children to be more Christian, taught them to speak English instead of their home language, effectively cutting off an entire generation from their culture. An estimated 150,000 students attended, with 3,000 confirmed deaths and an estimated 6,000. The residential schools were basically the opposite of Tuatsin, trying to force a singular culture onto the indigenous. Since then, the Canadian government and churches have tried to make many amends. The government has made several compensation packages for residential school survivors, spending billions of dollars for victims of abuse. Now that we've had a very brief history of the Indigenous peoples in Canada, let's move over to what the government has done in terms of education to include these topics into the curriculum. Introducing the British Columbia Tripartite Education Agreement. It's a massive legal agreement which agreed to put aside funding for Indigenous people to get into schools, to integrate the Indigenous culture into the BC curriculum, have special learning days for teachers, and more, highlighting a lot of significant things in the education field. First and foremost, they agreed that Indigenous families and communities have the right to raise their own children, establish their own education systems and institutions, and provide education in their own languages in whatever way they wanted. Consistent with the rights of the child, of course. The agreement did say that the schools need to give them the skills they need to thrive in a current day society, including 21st century technology skills, to prepare them to access any opportunities they choose for employment, college, and life choices. And they're confident in themselves and community and stuff. That in itself has opened many opportunities for the upbringing of Indigenous children, as the First Nations have the chance to raise them in their own way instead of relying on the Western school system. Already, we can see that two-eyed seeing is being applied as these schools still need to teach modern skills, but they can do it in their own language and ways, which is exactly what two-eyed seeing is. Another important part of the agreement highlights providing high quality and culturally relevant elementary and secondary education programs and services within the First Nation schools and the public schools, meaning even non-Indigenous people would be affected. So I decided to check the entire BC curriculum for anything Indigenous related and see what culturally relevant things are available. And before we go into it, I'd like to note that there are many ways teachers can make lessons based on these topics. They aren't held at salary points to teach every single thing here, including or excluding Indigenous things. But at the same time, a lot of what students are expected to know can have Indigenous related lessons. Like here in grade 1, where students are expected to know about different cultural communities, languages, music, etc., because it can easily be about Indigenous people. Anyways, I'm not going to go through all of them. Grades 1 to 2, they're expected to learn about different cultures, traditions, etc., which the teacher doesn't have to but can include Indigenous culture. They're also expected to know key events and development in the local community and explicitly mention First Nations communities. Grade 3 is surprisingly really heavy with First Peoples related content. There's a lot about cultural characteristics and ways of life of local First Nations, about different worldviews and beliefs, and First Peoples' use of oral history and stories, and more. So far, there's a lot about Indigenous culture as a whole and general practices. Grade 4 talks a lot more about First Peoples' history, like the fur trade, early contact with the Europeans, and key events in history such as the residential schools. Grades 5 to 10 dive a little deeper on specific topics like colonialism, religion, and more. There seems to be a lot of Indigenous history in Canada in the later grades, but the earlier grades are when you're learning more about the culture itself. Again, I'm not saying the later grades don't learn about the Indigenous culture, it's just that it doesn't become as much of a focus. Grade 11 has two courses where one of which again touches on the First Peoples, and finally grade 12 actually has an entire course labeled BC First Peoples. Also, as a side note, everything I just said was in social studies, so there's a lot more in subjects like fine art or science. Quite recently, in the 2023 to 2024 school year, all students working towards a BC Certificate of Graduation must successfully complete at least 4 credits in Indigenous-focused coursework, although still a total of 80 credits to graduate. They're hoping to advance reconciliation through education, and it seems like a pretty effective measure to make sure everyone learns something from the Indigenous. Alright, let's talk about the effects of what's being taught about Indigenous people. Having culturally relevant education, e.g., learning about their own culture, makes them more engaging for the Indigenous students and lets them potentially feel more included. Indigenous ways of learning, like oral stories, are also more hands on, which can be more engaging and fun than sitting in a traditional modern day classroom. Also, two-eyed seeing itself is a good concept to learn about, so let's see if there's truly been an improvement. In 2017 to 2018, there were 70,000 Indigenous students in the province, where 66% of them completed high school. To put into perspective, 84% of all BC students completed high school that year, and there were 538.8 thousand students. In the 2021 to 2022 school year, 74,000 Indigenous students attended public schools, in which 75% of them completed high school. For total BC students, 577,000 students attended public school, in which 91.4% of them completed high school. So, while the completion rates for Indigenous students might have had an increase, the completion rates for all students have also increased, meaning the increase for Indigenous students could be irrelevant. There's a very good chance that the Indigenous rates increasing weren't specifically from taking action towards them, but the BC schools in general got better. Now, when we think a little about all of this, we realize that most of this affects the First Nations going to school. Are the non-Indigenous students learning about the Indigenous culture helping these Indigenous communities? Well, learning only helps if there's action, and there's not really any direct action that would stem from learning about Indigenous history. However, we should note that it's still important to learn about history, so we're more racially aware of what happened in the past. But things do get interesting when you consider that learning about the Indigenous in school might ruin the culture for the students, who would consider it as just extra work. There's nothing we can do about it, though, and it's completely up to the teacher to try to make things engaging and the student to think it's interesting. So, we're straying a little into the conclusion area here. When we look back at how the government has tried to include Indigenous perspective, there's been an improvement in terms of the Indigenous child's experience in school. First Nations have the right to make their own schools, given that they teach skills that would help them in the modern world. Culturally relevant education programs and services would also be more engaging and help them feel more included. In terms of entire communities, at least they're getting a little more respect, and future citizens will know why the government is doing so much for these people. While there isn't any direct action that might stem from learning about them, it won't hurt. Nothing will truly be enough to make up for the residential schools, but the government has done all they could to help in the field of education. And as for the non-Indigenous students, Indigenous ways of learning would help with making things more engaging, as they have a more hands-on approach and might use oral stories more. And of course, they'd learn a little bit of what happened in the past and a lot about the Indigenous culture, as we've seen from the curriculum. So far, at least in my experience, the BC school system has done well to incorporate Indigenous views in history. While statistically there has been an increase in Indigenous and non-Indigenous enrollment and completion rates, the government's done so much there's nothing more to do. The amount of content revolving around First Nations, at least in social studies, and this project is an example of that. Fortunately, having the opportunity to learn about Indigenous impacts on the education system and the system's impact on the Indigenous, as well as fortunately giving the same opportunity to others.